like to remind everyone if they could speak loudly and clearly so everyone is able to hear. So we now come to Group 6 and the question that Clause 9 stand part of the bill, with which it will be convenient to debate Amendment 10 and Clauses 10 and 11. The question is that Clause 9 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And can I both welcome you to the most exciting event in Parliament this week, but also to say what a pleasure it is to serve with you.
I question that, but carry on.
What a pleasure it is to serve with you in the Chair. Clause 9 brings large and medium-sized managed services providers into scope of the NIS regulations. I will refer to these as MSPs during the debate. MSPs are organisations that provide an ongoing IT function, like an IT help desk or cybersecurity support, to an outside client. In doing so, MSPs often have widespread and trusted access to clients' networks and systems. A single targeted attack can ripple outward, disrupting thousands of others. This makes them attractive targets for cyber attacks. Just last year, an attack on Collins Aerospace halted check-in and boarding systems at major European airports, causing international disruption. These attacks highlight what can happen if a single point of failure is compromised, and the importance of managed services providers implementing robust cyber protections. Despite this, MSPs are not currently regulated for their cybersecurity in the UK. As organisations rely more and more on outsourced technology, we must close this gap. The clause provides essential definitions of a managed service and a relevant managed service provider to clearly set out which organisations are in scope of the regulations. Clause 10 imposes new duties on MSPs that have been brought into scope by Clause 9. For the first time, these businesses must identify and manage risks posed to the network and information systems relied on to provide their managed services. As part of this duty, MSPs must have regard for the state of the art, meaning they must consider new tools, technologies, techniques and methods that threat actors may employ. This includes AI, but it also means that the providers must deploy the right tools to mitigate risks, as well as take action to minimise the impact of incidents if they occur. By bringing MSPs into scope of the regulations and imposing these security duties on them, we will strengthen cybersecurity and resilience across supply chains, reduce vulnerabilities in outsourced IT services, and better protect businesses and services across the UK. I'm very happy to give it.
Alison Griffiths.
The Minister for giving way. Obviously, bringing MSPs into scope is the right direction of travel, but they sit at points of concentrated risk. They're not all the same, and the real risk is not size alone, but the level of privileged access and cross-customer dependency. So proportionality here will be critical if we want better security, not just box ticking.
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for her point, and I agree very much with it, and a similar sentiment she'd expressed elsewhere, in that the bill ensures that the focus is primarily on large and medium-sized MSPs, and that small and micro businesses are dealt with in a deeply proportionate way. I think it's an important point to bear into account. Clause 11, Madam Chair, defines what it means for a digital or managed service provider to be subject to public authority oversight under the NIS regulations. Public authority oversight is defined as management or control by UK public authorities or by a board where the majority of members are appointed by those authorities. These types of MSPs are already subject to requirements in the government cybersecurity strategy, which is mandatory for government organisations. This ensures that cyber resilience standards remain strong for services linked to public functions, while preventing disproportionate burdens on providers already subject to public authority companies. Madam Chair, in response to points that have been raised by honourable members in prior sessions, I will also just flag the engagement we have conducted in coming to the definition in question for MSPs. In particular, beyond the provisions of the 2022 consultation prior to the introduction of the bill, we have conducted a range of bilateral engagements. We have had multiple conversations with Tech UK, the industry body. We have had roundtables with digital firms. We have engaged through the NCSE-led MSP information exchange with 40 providers in this context. We have undertaken market research mapping the MSP market, and the heart of it, as a consequence, adjustments to the definitions of this particular provision have been agreed with incredibly deep and broad engagement right across the industry to arrive at a definition widely welcomed.
Will the Minister give way?
I'm happy to have something to say if you'd like to.
Lincoln John.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under you. Small to medium-sized enterprises are defined by headcount of full-time employees, and yet in the world of IT, and particularly managed service providers, data centres, digital service providers. That is not a very helpful metric when understanding size and scale. And so did the department, when coming up with this bill, consider in some way re-evaluating the size of digital service providers and managed service providers based on through flow of transactions or data rather than headcount? Because when I worked in the world of tech, you always looked at, there was a ratio for headcount which is totally different to other sorts of business.
Sure. The Honourable Member raises a very important point about the operating leverage of technology businesses. The provisions of the bill directly focuses on size as one proxy for risk, but it is not a complete or perfect proxy. And so what it does is elsewhere through the critical supplier provisions ensures that any smaller providers are able to be caught in the scope of the bill for essential services as well.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. So Clause 9 brings within scope of the NIS regulations a new category of technology service providers known as Relevant Managed Service Providers, or MSPs. Now, MSPs play a critical role in the UK economy, with research conducted by DCIT under the last government suggesting that there were 11,000 MSPs active in the UK in 2023, of which 1,500 to 1,700 are medium or large organisations that would be in scope of the bill. Micro and small enterprises offering managed services are excluded from scope of regulation, but have the potential to be designated as critical suppliers under other provisions, which I know we'll come to shortly. MSPs are critical to the functioning of multiple businesses they serve by offering contracted IT services such as help desk and technical support, server and network maintenance, and data backup. In many cases, they also provide managed cybersecurity solutions to their customer bases. And consequently, these businesses often have significant access to their clients' IT networks, infrastructure, and data, which makes them attractive and valuable targets. Very happy to give way.
I thank the Shadow Minister for taking the intervention. There was just a little bit of clarification with his initial statistics about the number of MSPs that fit into the scope of this and kind of what they are as a proportion as the whole the MSPs in the country. But could he clarify, he's talking about individual organisations rather than the scope of what they do, because I think if you've got large organisations, if you've got one large, for example, simplifying it, you've got one large organisation and 9 small ones, but the one large one takes up 80% of the market, and obviously although the proportions are slightly different. I just wondering, do you think you understand what I'm saying?
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank the honourable member opposite for his intervention, and that issue about scope and breadth of the organisations which are regulated by these provisions, I think, for me, is one of the most important parts of this debate, which I'm going to, we can wait a moment, will form some of the bulk of my speech, and noting that's also been also mentioned by the honourable member, my neighbour, the members for Spelthorne. The previous government consulted on bringing MSPs within scope of the regulation, and feedback on that consultation indicated strong support for it, with 86% of respondents in favour. And as such, there is a sound policy rationale for imposing cybersecurity and incident reporting regulations onto MSPs over a certain threshold. These MSPs will need to take appropriate and proportionate measures to manage risks to the security of networks and information systems on which they rely to provide managed services in the UK. However, as I've said at the outset, the devil really is in the detail, something that many people in our evidence session said as well, as to whether this bill is effective in protecting the sectors it seeks to regulate. Several industry stakeholders, including officers of MSPs and industry representation bodies, have raised concerns about the broad definition of MSPs in Clause 9. As drafted, this definition has the potential to cause confusion among businesses as to whether they are or not within scope. These relevant provisions will be brought into force through secondary legislation for royal assent, allowing time for consultation with industry on specific duties. So one of the questions I have for the Minister is if you could clarify whether its department will respond to concerns by consulting on a refined definition of what constitutes an MSP to provide much needed certainty to businesses operating in the sector. I'm also going to take this opportunity to speak to the amendment to Clause 10, which was in many members' names, including the member for Stone, Gwetware and Penkridge, who I know has a very keen interest in this area, being in the region in the West Midlands, which, as we know, has suffered massively, as in many parts of the country, from the impact of the problems with JLR. This amendment goes to legitimate concerns about the compound risk that could occur when MSP systems are accessed by malicious actors and those MSPs are providing services to a large number of entities within a regulated sector. Clearly, I think there are many reservations about the desirability of this particular amendment, including its potential to interfere with customer choice and the inconsistency with the approach to freedom of enterprise in other regulated sectors within this bill. It's also noteworthy that several witnesses who gave evidence to this committee pointed out the lack of skilled cybersecurity professionals available in the UK employment market to help regulated entities with effective implementation of this bill. It's conceivable that many regulated businesses, particularly smaller ones, will be forced to look for external expertise to comply with their obligations, and we would not want to artificially restrict access to expertise, even when done with the best of intentions. But the point is rightly made that larger MSPs and those providing services to the most critical sectors should observe the highest cybersecurity standards. And regulated MSP must have, MSP must have regard to any relevant guidance issued by the Information Commission when carrying the duties imposed on it. So could the Minister confirm whether and to what extent the important issues raised by this amendment will be covered in consultation and industry guidance? And I think this amendment and some of the debate that we've already had really, in a sense, goes to the heart of some of the thresholds and metrics which are being used as gatekeepers within this bill when an entity is being regulated or not. As I've already mentioned earlier in the debate this morning, 70% or at least 70% of government cloud procurement goes to the three big US tech actors. So, clearly those are huge operators, but the criticality of an MSP, I think as my honourable friend, the member for Spelthorne, alluded to, the size of it in itself doesn't necessarily indicate its essentialness in the system. One can imagine if there was a particularly unique type of service which was being offered, whether, for example, a cybersecurity service. Again, while it is a big company, Cloudflare, Salesforce had quite a substantial impact on the sector. It is not merely the size of an organisation, it's what they provide that could be relevant in terms of producing systemic risks to our economy as a whole. I'm very happy to give way to one from Stoffel.
I'm grateful to my friend for giving way. Having read the bill, does he understand where we have a situation where a managed service provider is providing services to, let's say, a hospital, so it be covered under the regulations too? If there is a reportable event that happens to the managed service provider, is there any obligation for their client, the hospital trust, to report it to, sorry, when I say to, I mean as well, or is it just the managed service provider who has got the responsibility? And if he's not clear, would he ask the Minister?
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for the get out of jail free card that he gave me at the end of his question, and indeed I would like to pass that question on to the Minister. But it also, the point is very well made in terms of trying to dissect the interacting and relevant duties which are occurring within this bill. Because the bill tries to chop up different actors within the digital ecosystem. It also sort of chops up public and non-public organisations, although there's a sort of commercial threshold that's being used. It also introduces confusion, I think, in terms of when it rightly tries to do a carve-out for Crown data centres. But I do have a question as to, when looking at Crown data centres, what exactly that means, a Crown service one could argue is something that's provided by, by the state, so therefore is a Crown data centre, a data centre which is serving a hospital. There's all these different components within the bill, not only just the 14 or however many number of regulators who are each operating. In evidence earlier this week, we had representation from Amazon who were telling us that they're regulated by 4 regulators. We've also got confidential information, which, as my honourable friend pointed out, which is going through. I think this sort of gets even worse on steroids when we come to the next clause, we're looking at critical supply networks, but it's just incredibly confusing. And I have to say, I cannot ignore, and I don't think the committee, and dare I say the government should ignore, the evidence we're receiving from managed service providers time and time again is, yeah, sure, absolutely, MSPs should be in scope, and these regulations are important in terms of helping, but we need clarity over what exactly that means.
My honourable friend give way.
Alison Griffiths.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way, and I think he's probably about to reference some of the commercial impacts on these MSPs, and we've already referenced the fact that they are of so many different sizes as well. But I think one of the concerns that we'll need to consider as a committee is whether there will need to be new contracts written. The level of uncertainty that is being created may render the existing frameworks they're operating within redundant.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank my honourable friend for that absolutely pertinent intervention. And the burden that she talks about, of course, isn't just limited to financial burden. It's also legal jeopardy that companies could find themselves in should they be effectively, through provisions of this bill when it becomes an act, are subject to, but they don't realise, and where there are these overlapping and competing duties. Businesses always, more than, I would say, more than anything else, perhaps even more than a low taxation regime, want certainty when it comes to the regulatory environment that they operate in. And this is made even more complicated by the fact that many of these organisations operate in different jurisdictions and have different competing regulatory frameworks and jurisdictions which they have to contend to. Now, my understanding is the majority of them try to take an approach which covers them, which in one jurisdiction, which will also cover them in the other, so that they have that sort of jurisdiction, that they have that overlap. But those are big companies, and they've got more capacity to do that. They've got more resource behind them to do that. The problem is going to be for the companies who are sort of just on the margins, who are struggling, and all businesses very happy to.
Chris Vince.
I found Secretary Minister very generous with his time, and again, this is not meant to be a controversial intervention, but would he recognise that the reason that the part about not omitting small and micro and small enterprises into this regulation is exactly the point about although I appreciate small can mean mighty in terms of businesses, and the point made by the member for Spelborn about actually a business may only have a small headcount but may have a very important role in the cybersecurity makeup of this country, but actually we recognise the challenge that micro and small businesses have to reach these guidance, which is why it's been admitted. Would he agree with that?
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank you very much for his intervention. Of course, I think irrespective of the size of the business, in terms of whatever definition we use, whatever size metric we use, businesses, I think the majority of the time, are always operating on fine margins and regulatory burdens not only have impact on them and their ability to operate are yet another cost, which means that their services and the cost of their services increase and actually has a deleterious effect of our economy more generally, because business burdens on business means to pass it on to the consumers, and that makes it more, it's more expensive to do business and thus as customers to receive it. But critically, and we haven't spoken about this in this bill line by line yet, is the competitiveness, the global competitiveness to do business. I'm very concerned that when you look at UK competitiveness in the digital and tech sector, sadly, and it saddens me to say this, we are in many different areas dwarfed by US big tech. Now, we need to make sure that I want our digital IT tech sector to be better, to be better and bigger, to be superior to our competitors. But that means that we need a framework which can support that. So this is why, even for the bigger businesses, this is really critically important in terms of the regulatory burden, especially businesses, of course, who can choose to a certain extent where they incorporate and where they focus in terms of doing business. So we want to make sure in the UK we have the best regulations, but best regulations also can often mean the ones which are least burdensome while still getting the certainty, which we spoke about earlier, in terms of businesses, for businesses to operate. And this is a highly competitive market. Yes?
Lincoln Job.
Just on cost, and I thank the Minister for giving way, and also speaking to my honourable friend, the member for Bognor Regis. Was the Shadow Minister as surprised as I was to see in the impact assessment the hourly rate for a contract lawyer to be £34 an hour, rather than the £300 to £500 an hour, which is, in my experience, the market rate?
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Well, I thank him for pointing out that discrepancy in terms of costings, and I think it links back to what I think should be a key principle, is that business and business modelling is best left to business people as opposed to government, and government has a facilitatory role, but fundamentally a role should be to get out of the way of business so that business can succeed and help our economy thrive and go forwards. And notwithstanding that, we do recognise that for the good of our economy as a whole, we need to ensure that elements of it which are critical, which are important to our economy, are regulated in such a way, particularly given the interconnected way that MSPs operate in terms of the digital sector. Any burden that we put on business is something which is going to limit growth, something that we all need. It's going to limit competitiveness, which is going to therefore result, particularly in this very footloose market, organisations and companies operating in other sectors, notwithstanding they'll have to comply with UK jurisdiction rules. As a general point, regulations are going to cause footloose industries to move and operate in different sectors, which again means less taxation revenue. It means more costs for clients here, and more difficult to do business. We need to make sure that our economy, whether that's the economy specifically, which is trading as an MSP, or more generally our economy as a whole, is as nimble as free as possible. And again, I just really can't labour the point enough. Just finish my point, I'll give away. I can't labour this point enough, which is the costs that we impose on businesses, particularly the cybersecurity business, the tech sector, through this bill, will be felt by our economy as a whole, and will mean that we have to pay for them through increased inflation, be that through food prices, energy prices, anything that our essential critical suppliers are providing. The costs, our NHS provision costs, will increase as a consequence through regulatory burden on businesses, as disparate and distant from the NHS as we see in this bill. Give way to gentleman first.
David Chapman.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and he's quite right to say that American companies have captured most of the market that he's talking about, particularly in terms of cloud providers. I wonder what he thinks is stopping British cloud providers from creating getting a larger share of the market that exists at the moment.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. So the cloud providers I've spoken to talk about several things. They talk about the crippling cost of energy in the UK, something that we need to drive down. Sorry, are you intervening? Sorry.
I'm just saying to...
You're telling me that you don't think it's in the scope. Well, we considered it was.
Cool. Thank you. So the cloud providers say to me that the energy costs are crippling, and that's highly problematic, which is why we need to drive down energy costs. They talk about challenges in terms of getting data centres, compute centres built, and issues around planning considerations and concerns, which is something we need to consider a whole across the country. They talk about the taxation environment and costs on businesses more generally, particularly when they're footloose, and they talk about the regulatory framework. Pretty much all of these are not particularly specifically within the bill, with the exception of the regulatory framework. So there's a lot which is suppressing the opportunities in terms of cloud providers and others in the sector from doing business succeeding. But there's a broader point, and it goes, I think, to the heart of the bill, and something, the philosophy behind we have to avoid, which is a sense in the UK that we are getting gummed up by regulation. We are sort of obsessing more and more about limitations and restrictions to businesses, and that people and organisations that do well financially and succeed and grow are seen as either targets or cheats by our environment. You know, something that you can just go for in terms of taxing and punish, or there's a sort of, we've diminished that can-do attitude when it comes to supporting the risk takers and the entrepreneurs who are the people and the organisations who are building these MSPs, building the data centres that our economy needs to rely on. So I think over and above that, there's a cultural issue which is impacting our IT and tech sector. And I think that what we can do as legislators is make sure in the things we have direct control over, which is the legislation put in front of us, poses as little a regulatory burden as we can, but a sufficient regulatory burden to meet our aims, and that we listen to business and we hear their concerns, and the concerns which, again, we hear time and time again, particularly when it comes to provisions in this part of the bill, is this lack of clarity is putting them at financial and legal risk, which is a very substantial concern. Did you want to?
Just
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you to my honourable friend for giving way. And I just wanted to refer back to the point you were making about lack of clarity in the bill once more. And I think there's a real possibility that firms will find that they are unable to, so an MSP may have one particular view of an issue, but their client may have another. And unless there is sufficient clarity in the wording of the bill, then we will have issues.
Spencer.
I thank her for her intervention, and I'll finish on this a few points in relation to this. The clarity is really important for legal clarity, because what we don't want, I have absolutely no issue with lawyers, but we don't want the consequence of this bill to essentially make a load of money for lawyers in terms of definitional challenges around how this bill is implemented. That's no good. It really is. It's not good for business. Business needs certainty in terms of how to apply and what regulatory framework they're under. It also is not going to help in terms of delivery of that. This business making these decisions, because there is regulatory uncertainty. My assumption is the default position will be to assume that you're not a regulated entity. So that means that the businesses won't take the provisions and actions that we would like to see them do as part of this bill. And so again, we have laws which we put down which everybody loses out. And then my final point, which I'll come to, in terms of the next clause, is just in relevance to the cutout, the carve-out when it comes to public authority oversight within this provisions. It's all well and good, the government sort of saying, we have an action plan, we're going to sort out government IT, we're going to sort out government the government cyber security risk when it comes to government services but the reality isn't playing out that way. The biggest risk we have, and the most vulnerable component of our digital IT infrastructure, is those links to government services. There needs to be change going forwards. And in fact, my sense is that when you have a company which is interacting and doing data sharing with government services and with public sector services, the biggest cybersecurity risk is likely to be those which are provided by government services. So we're doing this piece of legislation which is putting a whole host of burdens on the private sector, and yet we're silent to a large part in terms of what's happening in the public sector. We're putting that risk to them. That's really, that's really not good enough in terms of supporting our overall cyber security. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And I notice that the Shadow Minister has again tried to audition for the roles of the Treasury and talking about general taxation, and the roles of DBT and talking about general philosophies of regulatory reform. I will focus on the particular scope of the particular session that we're in, and in particular 4 aspects of it. One, the question of definition, which I know honourable members on the other side have raised, which have been frequently answered, but I'm happy to repeat again, which is that the scope of the MSP coverage, focusing on large and medium-sized MSPs, means that something in the order of 11% of MSPs by number are covered, but 97.6% of the UK MSP revenue is covered, and so I hope that will be sufficient assurance, again, of the coverage of this bill, and of course critical supplier provisions cover any others. Second, on the particular matter of concentration risk raised by my honourable friend in drafting Amendment 10, is indeed covered, and I hope sufficiently answered by the market share provision I just highlighted. Third, on the particular question from the honourable member for Spelthorne about notification overlap of responsibilities. In the particular example he highlighted, unless the hospital in itself had a reason to think that an incident posed a risk to it or capability of a significant impact on it, the notification would primarily sit on the MSP in question, but of course that would be for the relevant regulators to set out in clear guidance too. And finally, the question of Crown Data Centres, that is a specific observation around the organisation, Crown Data Centre. I'm happy to proceed on this count and really focused on Crown ownership of data centre provision to others as well. And for those reasons, I continue to put forward clauses 9, 10, 11.
The question is, Lincoln Job.
I'm grateful, Chair. Would the Minister please clarify from page 102 of the impact assessment whether he thinks that the hourly rate for a lawyer changing a contract is £34 an hour?
Minister?
I would simply point out to the honourable member that the pricing for law varies very materially, and I hope with the benefit of technology continues to be very accessible to all relevant providers.
Lincoln Job.
I'm sorry, but that's nonsense. And actually, can the Minister undertake to... the footnote from the £34 an hour for a contract lawyer directs us back to the Office of National Statistics. I hope he lives in the real world and he has worked clearly in the business world, and he knows that that is nonsense, and it does pretty well undermine that section of the impact assessment. Would he agree?
Yeah.
Minister?
Having closed the debate, Madam Chair, I'm happy to continue.
Okay, here we go. The question is that clause 9 stand part of the bill. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Point of order.
Point of order, Dr. Ben Spencer.
Point of order, Madam Chair. What mechanism is available for members for whom they are concerned there is a factual error in the impact assessment, and how to get that corrected?
The point has been made clearly now on the record, and we can take it beyond this room, and possibly you can write to the Minister afterwards to get clarification.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We now come to Amendment 10, to Clause 10, which has just been debated. Does anyone wish to push the amendment to a vote? Take that as a no. We now come to the question that Clause 10 stand part of the bill, which has already been debated. With the leave of the committee, I will put a single question on Clause 10 and 11, which has already been debated, standing part of the bill. The question is that Clause 10 and 11 stand part of the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 7, and the question that Clause 12 stand part of the bill. The question is that Clause 12 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 12 introduces a new power for regulators to designate critical suppliers to organisations in scope of the NIS regulations. These are suppliers who are so pivotal to the provision of essential, digital or managed services that a compromise or outage in their systems can cause a disruption that would have serious cascading impacts for our society and economy. I'm thinking in particular of the Synovus incident in 2024. 11,000 medical appointments were cancelled across London hospitals due to an attack on a pathology service provider. The clause ensures that the power to designate can only be exercised where suppliers pose a credible risk of systemic disruption and when the regulator has considered whether the risks to the supplier cannot be managed by other means In other words, a very high bar indeed. The clause provides safeguards for suppliers who must be consulted and notified during the designation process. It also requires regulators to consult with other relevant NIS regulators when they are considering whether to designate or decide to do so, ensuring that they have an accurate understanding of how suppliers are already regulated. Finally, the clause provides for designations to be revoked when risks no longer apply or a supplier has met the thresholds for regulation as a relevant digital or managed service provider. It should be noted that the clause does not set out the security duties on critical suppliers. These will be defined in secondary legislation following an appropriate period of consultation. To conclude, by addressing supply chain vulnerabilities, this measure strengthens the resilience of the UK's essential and digital services that the public rely on every day. I commend this clause to the committee.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Clause 12 merits close scrutiny because it is the point in the bill where risk is supposed to be addressed beyond the individual operator and into the supply chain. In plain terms, Clause 12 allows a regulator to designate a supplier as critical where disruption to that supplier would have a significant impact on the delivery of an essential or digital service. The trigger is impact, not size or sector. That approach is sensible, but I want to stress test how it works in the context of operational technology, also known as OT. Across power, telecoms, transport, water and industry, many essential services rely on the same family of industrial control equipment, IEDs. Substations, signalling systems and industrial plants may look different, but they often run on identical control devices and firmware supplied by a very small number of manufacturers. The risk is not hypothetical. A single vulnerability in widely deployed OT equipment can create a common mode failure across multiple sectors at the same time, even where each operator is individually compliant with its duties. At the moment, the bill places obligations squarely on operators of essential services. But in OT environments, operators do not control the design of equipment, the firmware, the vulnerability disclosure process, or the remote access arrangements that vendors often require as a condition of support. As Rick Ferg highlighted in his written evidence to this committee, uncertainty about how and when suppliers might be brought into scope can lead to defensive behaviour and late engagement. The risk is amplified in OT, where suppliers may discover vulnerabilities before operators do, and where one operator may report an issue while others in different sectors using identical equipment remain unaware. There is also a traceability problem. OT equipment is frequently sold through integrators and distributors. Manufacturers may not have a clear picture of where their equipment is ultimately deployed. Without that visibility, national scale vulnerability notification and coordinated response become very difficult. UK Finance has also drawn attention to the complexity of multi-tier supply chains and the need for clear accountability when regulatory reach extends upstream. Clause 12 recognises that reality, but its effectiveness will depend on how consistently and predictably designation decisions are made across sectors. My concern is not the existence of the power. It is whether, in practice, it will be used early enough and clearly enough to address shared OT risks before they become cross-sector incidents. Operational resilience today depends less on individual sites and more on the security practices of a relatively small, in fact I would actually argue very small, number of OT suppliers who sit behind them. Clause 12 has the potential to address that, but only if its application is focused on genuine systemic risk and supported by clear signals to suppliers and operators alike. For these reasons, this clause warrants careful consideration as the bill progresses.
Lincoln Job.
Thank you, Chair. In order to understand the impact of what we're discussing here, obviously we look at the impact assessment, and we're all often accused in this place of simply making rules, passing laws with no real sense of the impact downstream, particularly on small businesses. And so, having worked in the tech sector for 10 years and worked with data centres, worked with managed service providers, I'm acutely conscious, and worked with a lot of SMEs trying to grow them. I'm acutely conscious of not overburdening them. And so it's clearly hugely important that the government takes account of the impact of the measures that they are taking and the burdens that they are imposing on small and medium-sized enterprises. And so in order to understand the impact of what we are doing here, the laws we are passing here, it's important to know two things. Firstly, how many companies are going to be impacted, and secondly, how much it's going to cost. And so it's slightly concerning that I'm sure that the Minister's going to come on and say that this is all great, this critical suppliers bit, it's all very, very clear. It can't really be that clear, because on page 110 of the impact assessment, it says DFCIT is not able to estimate at this stage the number of small and medium-sized enterprises, or SME DSPs, that we will be designated as critical suppliers. So we can't tell how many there are. And equally on that page, it says specific duties will be set through secondary legislation, so the exact cost of security measures is not possible to estimate. So we don't know how many they are, and we don't know how much it's going to cost, but everyone here will be, on that side of the House, will be whipped just to say, that's okay, that can be done by someone else at another time. And I really don't think that we've got a strong sense of what the impact of what we are doing here is for real-world businesses. We've talked about the legal costs in an earlier session. So I would be grateful I look forward to hearing from the Minister his reassuring words about how very clear this clause is, and how it isn't just a blank cheque on the basis that we don't know how many people it's going to affect and we don't know what it's going to cost them.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we've moved on to discuss one of the provisions of this bill which has given rise to widespread industry concern regarding its scope and implications. Business supply chains, particularly for large operators of essential services and multinational companies, are becoming ever more complex. Increased digitisation of service provision across the board means that delivery of essential services can be vulnerable to severe disruption when the systems of critical supply chain entities are interrupted by cyber attacks. The government pointed to the 2024 cyber attack on Synovus, a pathology lab provider serving several London hospitals, as an example of the severe consequences that can flow from a cyber attack on a key supply chain provider. In that case, suspension of Synovus' services caused disruption to over 11,000 appointments and operations. The attack caused at least 2 cases of serious harm to patients, and tragically, one patient's death was attributed to the long wait for blood test results. Estimated financial losses from the attack exceeded 30 million. The previous government was conscious of intensifying supply chain risk and consulted on measures enabling regulators to designate individual suppliers as critical if they provided an IT service in which an OES or RDSP was dependent for the provision of its essential service. The response to that consultation showed overwhelming support for this proposal, but stakeholders argued that the designation process would need to be transparent and based on engagement with industry. Now, it's these vital elements of transparency and engagement, or rather the current lack of them, that's causing high levels of concern amongst supply chain entities that stand to be brought within scope of regulation when these provisions come into effect. Breaking it down, preserving agility for the Secretary of State and regulators to respond to emerging risks has been recognised as both a strength and weakness of this bill. However, lack of certainty is a particular concern in the context of critical supplier designation, especially as this bill, this part of it, has the potential to bring in large numbers of smaller and even micro businesses within the scope of the regulation, potentially by multiple regulators. This is a daunting prospect for smaller companies, even taking into account the caveated duty on competent authorities to coordinate in the approach to regulation of critical suppliers, the NISREG's amended Clause 14L. Several witnesses in the oral evidence sessions earlier this week, including Tech UK and ISC2, made strong arguments that SMEs are often lacking the financial and human resources to develop cybersecurity expertise and comply with regulation. These organisations will need additional time to prepare and need a better indication of the criteria that might be used by regulators to determine which supply chain providers are critical. Industry bodies have called on government to ensure a meaningful consultation on secondary legislation and guidance to ensure that the measures are fit for purpose and capable of practical implementation. So firstly, as part of the planned consultation, will the Minister commit to considering whether there are alternative approaches to regulation for increasing cyber resilience in companies below a certain size? Turning to the detail of Clause 12, such as it is, and the criteria under which entities can be considered for designation as critical suppliers, it's notable from the outset that critical suppliers can only be designated if they provide services directly to OESs, RDSPs or RMSPs. In the oral evidence, Dr. Ian Levy of Amazon touched on the complexity of sophisticated supply chain arrangements for companies like Amazon and commented that the value of a contract with a supply chain entity and the potential impact caused by interruption are not necessarily correlated, something that we've already covered several times earlier on in the sessions this afternoon. So I asked the Minister, what assessment has the government made of the need for regulators to look further down supply chains to identify risks from entities that are not in direct contractual regulations with OESs? How far does this go in terms of the dependency link in a complex supply chain providing OESs? Further, can the Minister clarify what is meant by the criterion stipulating that to be a critical supplier, an entity must rely on network and information systems for the purposes of providing services? Does this provision imply that level of access to the OES's own IT systems or access to shared IT systems are necessary for a designation? As drafted, it appears that nearly any service using an IT system to manage its business would be in scope. This could include cleaners, taxi firms, caterers, and so on. Is this the intention and provision? I'm going to come back to this a bit later in my speech. Moving on to the requirement that incidents affecting a critical supplier could affect the provision of essential services in a way that might have a significant impact on the economy or day-to-day functioning of society in the whole or any part of the UK. This concept is extremely vague and challenging for regulators to judge in practice. Some guidance is given as to the factors to be taken into account in paragraph 4, but remain too high level, I would submit, to be of practical use. The concept needs not only qualitative criteria, but quantifiable thresholds for metrics such as economic loss, geographical impact, and number of businesses or people who could be affected. Can the Minister confirm that this is a matter that will be consulted on and refined to provide much needed clarity to regulators and supply chain entities? Further, the role for OESs, RDSPs, RMSPs in the critical supply designation process under provisions is totally unclear. As drafted, the competent authority must consult with the proposed designated supplier and other interested competent authorities. However, the bill is silent on the specific need for consultation with OESs, RDSPs and RMSPs, receiving potentially critical services from those suppliers. This gives rise to the important question about what role OESs will have in informing regulators about the critical nature of various suppliers' services so that regulators can take this information into account in deciding which entities to designate. Perhaps this is implicit in the provision containing the duty for regulators to consult such other persons as they consider appropriate, but there's no definitive obligation for regulators to consult OESs. This appears counterintuitive. Surely these organisations are best placed to provide a starting point for which suppliers should be brought within scope of regulation as critical services. It was evident from the helpful testimony of senior officials from NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde earlier this week that OESs are in the dark about what their role will be in determining which are the critical service providers for their organisation. The involvement of OESs, RDSPs and RMSPs in the designation process is also vitally important when it comes to determining whether the goods or services being provided by a supplier under consideration for designation can be sourced from an alternative supplier. The existence of realistic alternatives may obviate the need for a supply chain entity to be brought in the scope of regulation, but in practice it may be very difficult for regulators to determine whether workable alternatives exist, particularly where services have been procured through highly technical, detailed and rigorous procurement processes. Therefore, can the Minister clarify what the Government considers the role of OESs, RDSPs and RMSPs should be in critical supplier designation process? Finally, given the number of gaps and uncertainties in the planned scheme for designation of critical suppliers, can the Minister update on the likely timescales and scope of consultation on this critical issue, one that goes to the core of whether this bill will be capable of practical implementation? And I'd like to finish by giving a sort of worked example to go through, because I've just gone through in my speech a lot of technical detail in terms of how we envisage the regulator operating in practice, but I think a real-world example would be helpful for members across the committee, and dare I say for the Minister, in terms of the challenges which I envisage of this clause operating as we would like to see. I totally understand what the aim and intention the Government and the Minister is trying to do in having this provision when it comes to services which in effect are sort of too big to fail, for want of a better argument in terms of OESs. But my concern is how all of this operates in practice. So I'm going to go back to the NHS, which is my sort of happy hunting ground, so to speak, in terms of what to talk about given my previous experience, but it's helpful. Because you've got an NHS trust, and the NHS trust, as members will know, will have a whole host of private sector providers doing all different functions and services for that trust. Many trusts will have different parts of their workforce provided by private sector providers. So, for example, cleaners, perhaps porters, taxi service and patient transport, locum doctor availability out of hours will be for often for a private service provider, sometimes in-house, but often through a private locum agency. The purchase and supply of medicines, items, maintenance of the estate, emergency boiler works. All of these will be private service providers. Of course, IT services themselves will be private service providers, as is the computer hardware. But given, my concern is, given the way the bill is currently drafted, it would be helpful if the Minister could also sort of unpick this work example a bit. Given the limitations access to the IT network, I don't really see in the modern day any private sector provider which is supplying to an OES not doing that in some way, shape or form through the IT system or network. So it strikes me that all of these, unless people are communicating by letter or sort of carrier pigeon, this is going to be operated, this is all going to be within the scope. So that criterion, to me, completely falls apart. So then we move on to systemic disruption. Very happy to give way.
On that point, I thank the Shadow Minister. Clause 12 is obviously drafted broadly and that's understandable. But in practice, many of these supply chains, as you have just so ably demonstrated, involve several layers of providers and sub-providers. And so I welcome, and I'm sure the Minister would too, the Shadow Minister would too, clarity on how regulators are expected to approach designation in these cases so that responsibility is clear and preparation can happen upstream rather than only after an incident.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank the member for her intervention, and she's figured out where I'm going to go to in a moment when it comes to the scoping of the regulator and how that communication process. But such is the depth of the rabbit hole that I think this provision creates, even in her intervention, where I thought she was going, but it's another issue that's just come to mind, which is a problem, is what happens in the circumstance where there is a critical supplier who acts as a proxy for multiple critical suppliers. So how does designation operate in that fashion? So there are suppliers which essentially operate a marketplace to a certain provision of services. How does that marketplace, is it the marketplace which is regulated, or is it each supplier within that provision of a marketplace? So a locum agency, let's say hypothetically, could be an umbrella company for multiple different smaller locum agencies, each of which they'd be sharing the sort of the incorporate risk as part of that. So in the first, going back to my first point, the idea that access to the IT network or system is going to be some sort of discriminatory, is going to somehow dichotomise into people within scope of this or not, seems complete nonsense. I think it's difficult to see what organisations, if they provide a service to a modern OES, will be in scope of it. The second then is what you talk about systemic or significant disruption. I often say that the best way of, if you wanted to, the best way of crippling a hospital would be to stop the cleaners cleaning rooms, would be to stop the porters pushing people around the hospital and getting them to their appointments and moving the beds. There is often focus on doctors and all the core sort of medical staff and nursing staff. And obviously, I myself often focus perhaps a bit too much on doctors, but it really is a whole team effort. And in fact, the most critical people are often the people who may not be the subject of most focus, again, such as the cleaners and the porters. So if the cleaners stop and don't turn up to work, the hospital grinds to a halt. If the taxis aren't taking people to and from hospital out of hours, or the patient transport isn't taking people to hospital, outpatients grinds to a halt. If the locum companies to fill gaps in rota aren't available to do that, and there's substantial rota gaps to make provision of service unsafe, the hospital grinds to a halt. If you can't get access to critical medicines, you can't maintain the blood gas machine or the blood pressure machine or the boiler breaks down, the hospital grinds to a halt. It's not just something as obvious as the tragic situation that's happened with in terms of blood and pathology testing that grinds it to a halt. I can't think of many private sector provisions that wouldn't have an impact if they were to be taken away from the hospital, that wouldn't have a substantial impact on that hospital. And if any members can think of something, then I'm very happy to stand corrected, but just skimming through, most would grind the hospital to a halt. So the idea that this significant impact definition, again, is going to be a discriminatory factor in terms of suppliers who are in that, again, I think just doesn't work. And even if you say, Ben, you're completely wrong, we found some providers. How is the arbitration going to occur in terms of the threshold? Very happy to give way.
Chris,
I thank you, Senator. I'm not going to say you're completely wrong, by the way, don't worry. I'm just going to make the point, I wonder whether the distinction may be with regards to time and how time-sensitive losing that particular service be. That was just a suggestion.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank him so much for that intervention in terms of the time it would take to find an alternative supplier, because that will bring me on to my alternative supplier discussion as the work example quite nicely. But just before I move on to that, because he has made a very good point. To be subject to these provisions is going to create a regulatory and therefore cost burden to an organisation which is designated to be a national critical supplier. So it is essentially, if I was a supplier of services, I want to have the best provision possible. I want to be cyber secure. I'd want to, have a gold standard service. But I might be nervous of being designated a critical supplier because of the regulatory burden that would pose on me, which would make me potentially less competitive in terms of getting contracts because of the costs that would ensue. So there would need to be an arbitration system where a company who is under threat of being designated a critical supplier could have that discussion and debate as to whether that was relevant or not. Moving on to the point the Honourable Member opposite made in terms of alternative services, I really have no idea at all how we can expect a regulator to delve into the complexities and the minutiae of what's available in the local economy to provide these services which the OSS is receiving. So are we expecting the relevant regulator to look through to see what taxi services are actually available, not sort of fantasy available on paper but not in reality, what taxi services are available in that local ecosystem which could supply to that hospital the operator of essential services? What is the scope of research they would have to do? What considerations would they need to take in terms of how much the taxis cost? How effective? What about the procurement decisions and process that have already gone through? Most public sectors, particularly We also have complex procurement rules in terms of for setting up their contracts. That's before you even begin to start considering other concerns which we subject to regulatory provisions when it comes to health and safety. So, for example, going to taxi services, if the regulator decided this is going to be at threat of becoming a critical supplier, does the taxi service have the ability to deal with someone who has a cardiac arrest? Does it have the ability to deal with somebody who needs oxygen? Does it have the ability to deal with somebody who has perhaps a behavioural disturbance? Does it have the ability to manage people with physical or mental disabilities? You know, what is the scope of that particular service provision? Of course, the experts are going to be the people who commissioned it in the first place, and yet on the face of the bill, there's no objective requirement for the regulator to speak to the OS in the first place in terms of how this provision and service was accrued. And then in terms of it being available, exactly to the honourable member opposite for Newcastle and Lions, sorry, not it's Harlow, sorry. Harlow. I got it right in the end. It will take some time to make up for that one. So I apologise to the honourable member for Harlow and his constituents, but but look, the point about the time to shift through, how is this going to be evidenced? How is it going to be investigated? What resource is going into this? And this is just for a taxi company. So, and then when you expand it to cleaners, porters, locum agencies, medicines provision, this is just for the NHS. Is the provision of services going to be something which is geographically conscribed, or is it going to be something which comes across the country? Because I'm sure one can find alternative services to provide taxis to St Tommy's in Birkenhead, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's available in a reasonable time frame or sense in terms of the designation of supplier. And finally, I will finish in terms of the issue about how this is going to be investigated and assessments made in terms of this sort of designation. How does the regulator know what it should look at? How does this conversation go? Does the hospital trust go to the regulator? Hello, regulator, here is a list of all the private service providers who are supplying our OES. Here's a list. And by the way, this list is going to change every single day. It probably is changing every day, every week, every month, because these things are in flux and we secure things from different services. Here you go. What's the regulator going to do then? Is it on the regulator to go through this list and then to go through and do an assessment and an appraisal? Is this a critical service to that OES that we need to then get in the scope of regulation? Or does it work the other way around? Is it the regulator's going to turn up and go through and sort of go through the company notes and the records, some of which will be highly commercially sensitive, and that's of course relevant when it comes to alternative providers, and when it comes, in terms of this operation, when this discussion is taking place between the regulator and the OES in terms of whether designation is available. And then when someone's being investigated as to whether an organisation is being investigated, I mean a private sector one, as to whether it should get OES status, who has the burden of proof? What's the evidential burden on who? Is it on the regulator to demonstrate that they're an OES, that they're a critical supplier? Is it on the hospital? Is it on the private company themselves? How can this be disputed? What's the appellate system? Because these bills and these regs, the minister has made very clear these are really important and they're going to have teeth and they're going to change things, but if they're going to have teeth and they're going to change things, then by definition they're going to produce a cost and a burden on business. Now, we recognise that this legislation needs to be proportionate, but if you're a business who is about to be subject to a regulatory burden, I think it's reasonable that you've got to have your ability to make representations and, for want of better words, if necessary, have your day in court in terms of that designation and the ability to challenge it as necessarily going forward.
Lincoln John.
I don't want to add sort of spurious hypotheticals because this is... so I won't. And what I'll do is talk about the real world. So I'll talk about the Maypole Special School in my constituency, which I visited the other day. 20 members of staff, 18 pupils. They have people coming as far as Wandsworth. They book the transport is paid for by the local education authority from whence that pupil lives. Is a school meant to, it's clearly critical that the children get to the school. Could be the same with a hospital, in fact. Would it be up to the members of staff at the Maypole School to find out whether Addison Lee use a managed service provider or indeed a data centre? Because that seems quite a tricky thing for them, A, to know about and B, to fulfil.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I really appreciate the member for Spelthorne's intervention. I think it goes to the heart, really insightful at the heart of what is the concern about the way these provisions are currently drafted. Because I really do struggle to see how effectively, if you're an OES and you're providing a service to an OES, you would be able to argue that you're not within full scope of these regulations. And we have a lot of OESs in this country. Now, it may be this is what the Minister's intention and the government's intention is, that essentially to have a sort of proxy, if you are supplying to an OES as a proxy regulatory framework going forwards. It's kept very loose because there is some flexibility in that. And that in itself is going to be a problem. I mean, I worry, that a lot of providers are going to think to themselves, why should I provide to an OES when I might be at risk of being designated a national critical supplier? That's the concern, surely, that effectively it will have a chilling effect on organisations supplying to OESs because of the risk of being found within the scope of this additional regulatory burden. Now, don't get me wrong, like I've said, I think companies should be taking their cybersecurity seriously and approaching that, and I think everyone should take their cybersecurity really seriously. But not everyone should be subject to various regulations and data sharing requirements that this bill provides. So I suspect there'll be lots of organisations who'll be very concerned. And of course, if you are at risk of being designated a critical supplier, companies are going to already, I suspect, be instructing lawyers and other organisations to manage that corporate risk. Because if you start supplying to Hospital Trust, or whoever that may be, you might think, well, actually, I'm not likely to be at risk of being designated, so we need to start doing some work and doing some investment, either to challenge that designation or to start doing the preparatory work. Maybe that's what the intention is, to effectively regulate the entire sector providing to OESs without actually lifting a finger in terms of regulation for this. If that's the case, I'm sort of sad, really, because I think it would be better just to be clear-cut about it. And I'd be grateful for the Minister to answer that point as well directly. And then finally, in terms of OESs, we have already mentioned and spoken about the fact that the government and local authority IT infrastructure and services are one of the biggest risks in our system. I was really struck by the evidence from the NHS on Tuesday, where they have a data sharing operation with adult social care, which of course is provided by local authorities. It seems quite perverse, if I may, that there could be a situation in which a GP, which is a private organisation, could be deemed as a critical supplier to a hospital in terms of their patient information sharing. And in fact, quite frankly, I'd like the Minister to answer that question specifically. Does he envisage primary care GPs being exactly within scope because of data sharing of hospital records with NHS trusts? But you could have a situation where your GPs are in scope of being critical suppliers, but social care records provided by the local authority aren't. And so you have all these weird potential risk of all these odd situations emerging because of the scope and the looseness of these provisions and all the requisite harms and problems going forward. On that, Madam Chair, I look forward to hearing the Minister's responses on my points.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. First, can I respond to the very applicable point from the Honourable Member from Bognor Regis about operational technology, and I can confirm to her that both vendors and providers of operational technologies will be covered by this provision, that they need to be like a test for critical supplier designation. I think it's an important aspect in thinking about the supply chains and the presence of operational technology vendors and providers. The Honourable Member for Spelthorne raised a very apt point around the proportionality in the provisions of the bill, and in particular the impact assessments, statements or limited statements on critical supplier impacts. As you all know very well, the bill takes a very nuanced position on proportionality. Where specific sectors are designated, there is a total clarity of number and ultimate impact because we have sight of that. For the particular question of critical suppliers, which was a big ask of industry, the reason it simply doesn't is because it is not for government to specify how a business can or cannot continue. It is for businesses and regulators to work that through by understanding the depth of expertise businesses have. We've started to do that, but that is precisely why the particular provisions for critical suppliers have been delegated to secondary legislation and subsequent guidance as well. I'm very happy to give away the end of my speech, and I commit to doing so. On his particular question about the school that he raised, I'm happy to confirm the schools are not in scope of the bill. And in response to the Shadow Minister, first I would highlight that the individual provisions of the five-step test do not count as sufficient in themselves, but only in cumulative terms. And I think that would answer a series of the logical puzzles that he tied himself up in. On the particular question of how designation will work, I'm very happy to confirm to the House that regulators are expected to use existing oversight of operators of essential services, relevant managed service providers and relevant digital service providers to identify potential critical suppliers for designation. They can also ask organisations for more information to support their assessments. This process will be supported by future supply chain duties, which would require organisations to share supply chain risk assessments with regulators. And a supplier can only be designated after the regulator completes an investigation process, including notices and consultation, and confirms that the precise criteria are met. Designated suppliers will also have the right to challenge the decision through an independent appeals process. Third, I'm happy to give away at the end, and I commit to doing so for both members. On the particular question of consultation, I'm very happy to confirm that the team in question has set up an implementation-focused effort. We have started to engage with regulators already, and I know there is an extensive process of engagement with business, as has been conducted historically, now on the provisions of the bill. And finally, I would also point to the Honourable Member, the Shadow Minister, that a number of the logical puzzles he highlights, having worked in a range of businesses and public sector organisations, most have business continuity services. So this hypothetical idea that businesses don't understand alternative provision and where they are or not in a position of exposure is actually in practice in the real world well solved. And I would give more credit to our expert witnesses from the NHS Scotland than he did in recognising that they said, indeed, this question of critical supplies is one they often and frequently deal with, Madam Chair, in coordination with competent authorities. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Member from Southampton.
Lincoln John.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. He came back with an answer on proportionality saying, I think I'm paraphrasing, that it's not for government to decide what's essential. He missed out the next bit, which is we're just going to regulate them and pass laws about them, but we don't know how many they are and we don't know how much it's going to cost. So would he accept that characterisation as being the logical conclusion of what he said? Secondly, he said that schools were not covered under the ambit of this bill. Can I just, as far as I'm aware, patient data and children's data are two of the most precious things that we have. So I would just like to know why schools aren't.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. On the first point, I'm afraid I don't think that was an appropriate characterisation because of the particular point I made, which is where the sectoral scope is clear and the risk is very clear by direct exposure of critical national infrastructure and essential services. We have specified that on the face of the bill. We have looked at the precise impacts in the impact assessment. Where we're looking at what I would expect to be a very limited number of critical supplies into those services, we have made sure that regulators and businesses directly have the flexibility to set it rather than being set here in Parliament. Happy to give way.
Chris Vince.
I don't disagree. I was going to intervene on the gallant member for Shelthorne, but he's bigger than me. I was just going to say, I do recognise the points he's making about the numbers of critical supplies, but I come at it from kind of the other angle, which is that to do nothing is potentially leaving those critical supplies providing risk. So actually, although we may not know the exact numbers, as he's correctly asserting, actually it's important that we do something and actually bring in these regulations as soon as we can to actually protect our critical infrastructure.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that point, and can I also say that this isn't something that has come out of nowhere. It has been an ask of industry, it has been an ask of a number of organisations that we do so. I will also say that in addition to a very clear five-step test for critical supplier designation, there is also a provision and my expectation that the particular requirements on those are much more proportionate, which is why they have been distinct in the understanding that they'd be lower in most cases where the risk assessment suggests so, as a consequence of specification and secondary legislation and guidance. And on the question of schools, and more broadly on the question of public sector authorities, I accept entirely that schools, and in particular the handling of patient pupil data, is a really critical aspect of our public service operations. The reason public service authorities have largely been left out of the scope of this bill is because we don't need to wait for a legislative process to act. We have been working very closely, not least through the government's cyber security strategy and the cyber action plan, to ensure that pupil data is kept secure and robustly. I'm happy to give way to the Shadow Minister.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank him for giving way. I mean, he is, of course, fully within his rights and ability to sort of snarkily dismiss the questions that I've raised to him. But I would just point out to the Minister that stuff that's debated in Parliament, whether that's at committee or on the floor of the Chamber, is relevant information when it comes to legal disputes in the future when this act is passed. The questions I have asked about the application of provisions of this bill, I think, are very important. I think they're quite important to what I expect to be legal disputes arising from the implementation of this act. When people look back through his dismissive comments, I hope they have other resources they can go to in terms of settling these legal arguments. Or he may choose to respond in fully, whether now in writing, if he can't provide me an answer.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I believe where the Shadow Minister laid out any specific concerns, I was able to set them out, not least in the process for designation of critical suppliers and the availability of an appeals process. Where they were more in the realm of specific hypothetical puzzles, I have stayed clear of it for precisely the reasons he highlights, which is that this is serious stuff that can form the basis of how businesses and others plan, rather than specific judgments that we ought to speculate on in this House.
The question is that Clause 12 stand part of the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 8 and the question that Clause 13 stand part of the bill, with which will be convenient to debate Clause 14. The question is that Clause 13 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 13 ensures that operators of data centres provide essential information to regulators, enabling them to properly monitor their sector and its cyber resilience. This clause requires operators to submit key details, such as names, addresses and contact information, within 3 months of designation, and to update regulators within 7 days if anything changes. Regulators are required to maintain a list of designated entities. By keeping regulatory records current, Clause 13 strengthens our ability to monitor and protect essential services and respond to incidents that could affect businesses, public services and national security. This clause plays a key foundational role in the bill's wider framework for cybersecurity and resilience. Like Clause 13, Clause 14 places legal duties on digital and managed service providers to provide essential information to their regulator, in this case, the Information Commission. Like operators of data centre services, RDSPs and MSPs will be required to register with the Information Commission within 3 months, submitting key details such as names, contact information, and to update regulators within 7 days if anything changes. Organisations based outside the UK will be required to nominate a UK representative and provide contact details. To strengthen cross-agency support and recognise the key role these businesses play in the UK economy and society, the Information Commission will be required to share its registers of relevant detailed digital and managed service providers with GCHQ. These proportionate steps will enable authorities to do their job and respond when it matters.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Clause 13 requires in-scope data centres and operators to provide certain information to their designated competent authorities, which, subject to the amendment we passed earlier, will now be solely Ofcom, and to keep that information up to date. The information includes the data centre operator, address and names of directors. It must be provided within 3 months of the data centre's operator's designation, and for data centres that meet the threshold criteria, this would be 3 months after Clause 4 of the bill comes to force. Other OASs are not subject to an equivalent requirement to provide information to their sector regulator. This reflects, of course, the fact that government currently has limited information about the data centre sector. RDSPs are already required under Regulation 14 of the NIS Regulations 2018 to provide their contact details to the Information Commissioner as their sector regulator. And Clause 14.2 amends Regulation 14 of the NISREGs to require RDSPs to provide more information, including about their directors and the digital services they provide. It would also require the information to share a copy of its register of RDSPs with GCHQ. Clause 14.9 requires RMSPs to register with the Information Commission and to submit the same contact details as RDSPs. RMSPs must nominate a UK representative if they are based outside the UK. So the Information Commission would be required to maintain a register of RMSPs and to share this with GCHQ. Clauses 13 and 14 give Ofcom and the Information Commission access to more detailed information about regulated entities and facilitate regulatory oversight of the data centre, RDSP and RMSP industries in the UK.
Minister? The question is that clause 13 stand part of the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the question that clause 14 stand part of the bill, which we've just debated. The question is that clause 14 stand part of the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And now coming to Group 9, Amendments 1, 2 and 4 to 9. These are Iqbal Mohammed's. Is anybody here to move them on his behalf?
I'd like to speak to them. Yeah.
You wish to speak to them? Okay, we now come to Group 9 and Amendment 1 to Clause 15, with which it will be convenient to consider Amendments 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just for my clarity, I'll speak to the amendments in the name of the member for Dewsbury and Batley, but then wait till the next grouping then to speak to clauses 15 and 16 and amendments in the name of the official opposition. So I think from the outset it's important for me to say that while I have spoken to the member for Dewsbury and Batley sort of more generally and responded to a debate which he put forwards regarding AI, I haven't spoken to him specifically regarding these amendments which he's tabled and their precise purpose. But I think looking at them, you can see, given his concerns about the AI sector and his background, where he's going with this. Because these amendments, broadly speaking, are looking at making sure that in the reporting requirements which are coming through in these clauses, there is an ability to measure whether adaptive AI or large language models have been responsible for a cybersecurity breach or within the systems themselves. This derives from what we're seeing more generally, which is happening in terms of the cybersecurity sector. So we know that online people can, and we had evidence from this earlier, it's possible to essentially purchase a cybersecurity sort of hack suite of software. It's possible to purchase people, pay for organisations, for people to do hacking. One can get training in terms of this, and a lot of hacking and cybersecurity breaches are now expanding because of large language models and the use of AI in terms of probing systems. I don't know if we have a sense of scope in terms of how much this is a problem specifically in the UK, whether that's in terms of individual businesses, organisations which are going to be regulated through the purposes of the bill. And so I can understand as I interpret them, the point of these amendments, which is to get a data set together in terms of where AI or automated decision making has been used in terms of posing a particular cybersecurity risk. I think it also goes to a more general point in terms of I think there has been a lot of debate in this place, but over the years as to whether what we are doing as a country, but also with equivalent democracies when it comes to regulation on us around artificial intelligence, the use of large language models, building on the various Bletchley conferences and over the work, and what sort of guardrails we need to think about in terms of imposing both LLMs and AI in the UK, but how we approach AI being used by hostile state actors, particularly things like bot accounts. I understand that quite a few there have been at least the use of deepfakes, the use of bots, etc., is an emerging risk when it comes to getting around and as a method of sort of cyber attack. And I think this then adds broader issues with regards to how we have transparency around bots on the internet, bots on social media networks that can get into various IT systems and accounts and effectively pretend to be somebody else as a means of getting around the cyber security system. As with all things, we don't know necessarily what we don't know, and I can understand why amendments such as this could be put together with a view to having increased reporting requirements to have more evidence in terms of the scope of the problem and the threat that it poses forwards. And so I'd be very grateful for the Minister if he could respond on those points in terms of his sense, in terms of how much of a problem this is, particularly when also the need or not in terms of reporting requirements. I know there has been, I believe it was originally His Majesty's Government's plan to consider bringing forwards an AI bill. While I think there's pros and cons to that, and I sort of remain agnostic on it, I'd like to know, as I from the position of His Majesty's opposition, I would really like to know what his plans are around the AI landscape, and if there is a view, particularly with the King of Speech upcoming, to revisit the idea of bringing forwards an AI bill, which may make amendments such as this obsolete.
To what's relevant to now, this debate. Minister?
Thank you, Chair. Can I firstly appreciate both the intent behind the suggested amendments and the Shadow Minister's position of understanding but not supporting them, which I share. And in part because I share the Shadow Minister's concerns about the potential of emerging risks posed by AI systems, not least in the realm of cyber security. And at the same time, I'm very conscious that we have not specified any specific risk vectors on the face of the bill from a reporting or focus point of view for the NCSC or regulators. And to do so simply in this context would be to place an undue priority on one category or source of risk. And so for those reasons, whilst I understand the motivation and I'm very conscious of the particular risks posed by AI systems, I would urge members to consider the withdrawal of the amendment or not moving them for the reasons that the bill is technology agnostic rather than specifically focused on particular areas of risk. We continue as a government to work very closely on ensuring that AI risks are mitigated primarily at the point of use, but also through extensive government capability, not least in the AI Security Institute.
Is everyone content to withdraw the amendment? Oh, ask him. Yeah, okay. Dr. Ben Spencer, are you happy to withdraw the amendments, or would you like to press to a vote?
Oh, no, forgive me, John, I didn't realise I mind to withdraw, so I certainly don't want to push them to a vote.
Okay. Is everyone content then for the amendment to be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn. We now come to Amendment 2 to Clause 15.
I beg to move that this debate be now adjourned.
Okay, we will adjourn for the time being. The question is everybody happy for this to move to adjourn? And we stand adjourned, and we will be back Tuesday, 9 a.m. 9:25.